is there a separation between brain and mind. In the past, as is still the case, if you wish to induce a mystical state, then asceticism is one way to do it. That is, if you do ascetic practices, whether it's fasting, going out and being by yourself in the all alone for long periods of time, sometimes using pain, doing anything which is really hard to do. Within a very short period of time, if you practice this form of mystical experience, you can be seen as being special. Not everybody does it. As you know, I had my first class in the prison on Sunday. And I was talking to the prisoners, and one of the things that I feel when I go into the prison is that they have had this asceticism in lots of ways. First of all, they are stripped of all their possessions. They are absolutely almost purified of having anything which they possess. And they are forced to stay in this one place, day after day. These are all these, and there is suffering, there is pain, it's very difficult. And yet, with many of them who've been there for a very long time, you talk to somebody who's done this for 30 years, you are talking to somebody who in one sense is quite special. And many of them, I am struck by the fact that I have never met such honest people in my life. The asceticism has stripped away all the filters. And they just come right out with it. You don't feel any barrier that they're thinking something which they're not saying. It's like when you faced what they've had to face, there's no reason to put up any kind of facade. You don't have any feeling that you've got a facade that anybody's going to pay attention to anyway, so what do you got to lose? But as a result, there is a directness, and they are some of the best teachers I've ever had, and I'm going to talk more about it in this lecture. I have never had the experiences that I have when I go in and work with those people, and part of it comes from this enforced asceticism to some degree, which has created in them, if they can get through it, they have a strength and they have something which a lot of us have never been tested enough to know whether we have it or not. We don't get tested like this. Well, we know that the Buddha turned his back on asceticism as the ultimate solution. We know that he went into the forest and he practiced ascetic life. He threw away all his clothes. He tied rags together from corpses, which would normally pollute you. He polluted himself. He went through all of this. And remember, for the Buddhists, to go into the forest at that time was really dangerous. These were rainforests. They had big animals. They had snakes. They had all the insects. It was dangerous to do that. That alone was, to live out there by yourself in that environment was an ascetic experience. And we know that the Buddha himself really pushed it as far as he could push it. In other words, he brought himself right to death almost. before he said, wait a minute, this isn't working. Here I am, almost about to die because I have been practicing these ascetic things of not eating and being here all by myself and yet I haven't gotten it yet. So that the mystical experience, in one sense, from asceticism, which asceticism will give you, there's no doubt about it, I'm firmly convinced of this. If you practice some form of asceticism, you will have altered states of mind. It's just a given. Talk to anybody who has severe pain. That's asceticism. You have severe pain for a very long time. Person who has to deal with that, it changes them. They either handle it and become a person who can deal with it, or it defeats them. It's very hard. It's not as if we don't all face this to some degree, but never to the degree that some people have done it. So the mysticism of ascetic practice was definitely a part of the Buddhist tradition, and yet it was not conceived to be sufficient. Every ascetic action that you can see has its dark side. Anorexia is a terrible disease. It strikes women more than men, but it strikes both genders. If you run into somebody who really has this disease, it is life-threatening. So you can say fasting is a way to have a mystical experience, but you have to know that it's, in a sense, it can be itself pathological. And you have to ask yourself the question, if I'm going to do this, is it pathological? Or if it's pathological, at what point can I determine when it goes across the boundary? So we see people who have developed almost a fear of food. I had a colleague who became anorexic, and it was really sad to me because she always felt she was eating too much. And she ate almost nothing. She said, oh, I had a big breakfast, and if you tied her down, what did you have for breakfast? She had a cracker. You know, it was just so much. Because it reached pathological things where her understanding of what she was doing had passed beyond being truly aware of a reality. And so the asceticism and the ascetics who practice it are always faced with this. When is it serving its function to lead to an altered state? And when is it crossing over into a pathological thing? So beyond perception has always meant that somehow you want to induce a trance state. And to induce trance states, people do this in all types of ways. Drumming, dancing, rhythmic activity, meditating even, sometimes even with pain, sometimes extreme stress on the body. For example, in India, and I really could appreciate that this weekend where I was down near El Centro, where it was 111 or 112, and it was really hot. And one of the ascetic practices in India is on the hottest day that you could think at noon, you go out and build a fire and you meditate in front of the fire. You put the body under extreme stress, and under that stress, you can have a non-ordinary state of mind. Well, I felt this weekend I was witnessing it because in our California state prisons, they allow Native Americans to have sweat lodges. And lo and behold, every Sunday, no matter how hot it is, they build a sweat lodge and build a fire and heat the stones and go into the lodge and sweat and have a purification experience. All of these extremely stressful things will produce an altered state. We have ample evidence that that is the case. Solitude will do it too. You don't think about solitude very much because most of us long for a little solitude, but we find it hard to really find it. We are with people on the freeway, we are with people around us all the time, and so solitude is not so easy to come by. But if you really enter into solitude for a very long period of time, the stress of it will also produce an altered state. The Chinese Buddhists would do this by people who decided to be solitary. They would seal themselves in a room with just a little hole where the food could be passed into them. And they would stay there without speaking for 2 years or 3 years. Some people can't take it when you do that. The stress is too much for them. Now, after about a week, they say, okay, I'm ready to come out. This is it. This is as much of this as I can take. Others find it that they say they've never had such marvelous meditation. They just go into deep states of meditation, and they're sorry when they begin to break down the door because the allotted time is up and they have to come back out into the world. I'm just saying that there's two sides to all of this asceticism. It can be really allow you to enhance your experience to such a degree that you have one of these non-ordinary states of experience. And yet, on the other hand, it can be extremely stressful and really hard. And it depends on who you are, how you handle it, and what you do with it. So normally, people should not undergo extreme asceticism without preparation. They ought to have the training it takes to be able to do these things. You shouldn't just say, I'm going to do it, and go out there. I had a neighbor friend who decided that he wanted to get away from the world and everybody in it. He wanted to be totally alone, take a vow not to speak. So he figured the best way to do it was to go up into the Sierras and to hike. And he prepared himself for this. He was going to do it all alone. We all said to him, you realize this can be pretty dangerous because you got bears and you've got cougars and you've got a lot of problems up there. It was so interesting to me to see that I felt, was not ready for it. As much as he wanted it, he wasn't really ready for it. His luggage was so huge that it took 3 llamas. He had to have 2 of everything, 2 pairs of glasses, 2 sets of glass repair kits. It went on and on. And we all tried not to laugh when he began to describe all the things that he was doing. And then he had his cell phone just in case, so he could call his psychiatrist if he had really emotional problems. I thought, he's not ready for this. And solitude for him was, I could see the stress it put on him. And whether it worked, I'm not sure. But the Buddhists say one should wander solitary like a rhinoceros horn. And we have in the text the idea of, I want to go into solitude. I don't want anybody to see anybody except someone who brings me my food. This is like the forest meditation in Thailand. The monk goes out, it's not too far away from the monastery, it's a little house that they go to. Nobody comes there except someone who leaves food and goes away. Nobody speaks to them. They just meditate in that kind of solitude. But of course, it's solitude that is supported in one sense, because they're getting their food and they are being seen every day that they're okay. But solitude also has a pathological side. For some people, there is a fear of being alone. And if you have the fear of being alone, I can tell you from knowing one person who has this, autophobia is one of the worst phobias. Because you cannot be in a room by yourself. The room just closes in on you. You've got to have somebody with you all the time. So there can be the other side, which is the pathological thing of so fearful of being alone that you can't really have it. You can't experience it. So that we're always torn. That's why the emptiness comes in. On one hand, something that you do can be enhancing. But that same thing, on the other hand, can be pathological. And you've got to ask yourself the question, when is it on which side of that equation? And how do I know when it's on one side or the other of that equation? That's why I think teachers and guides and spiritual mentors are so important to prepare people if they want to do some of these practices. That just setting out with 3 lamas across the Sierras, I don't think is the solution to this. That you want to prepare yourself and understand yourself enough that you can do it and get benefit from it. Other people use meditative practices. That is, it's a psychosomatic practice. Somatic in this sense, meditation is also your body. If you don't believe it, I don't think you've ever meditated. Because when you first start to meditate, I can tell you, 1 hour of sitting on a cushion when you've never done it before can be absolutely painful. Your body is screaming at you to say, no, I can't take this. It is somatic, it is physical. Your body, you must train your body so that you can do it. And if you're under extreme pain, there's no possible way that you can enter this calm state of meditation. So the somatic is there as well as the psycho. That is, the mind is at work, but also the body. And it's controlling the body and bringing the body into that kind of control where what you are doing, the body is accepting and you are at one with this experience. So once again, it's both enhancing and it gets over into problems and troubles that you could create when you don't understand or you don't understand the difference. So we know from our sutra that there is a lack of what we call the centurium. But what we want in the meditation is a reduced self. However you say it, it says, if I become one with the universe, I have reduced the distance between myself and everything else that's in the world. The more I'm thinking of my own ego, the more separated I am from everything else in the world. It's just, as we say, me, me, me. And we all have that. Well, I'm sure guilty of it. So we have it, but how do you get another experience without that falling into pathology? In other words, it can't be that you hate yourself. That is not a way to have reduction of self. It cannot be just the rejection. It has to be a recognition of the context in which you are finding yourself, in which you stop making such clear distinctions with everything around you. And so we talk about that as a reduced self. It's just reducing the distance that we have through these meditative states. But we can have alienation. And this is something which a lot of people have as the pathological side to trying to have a reduced self. We have a pathological withdrawal from others. We can have meaninglessness in social contacts. But the Buddhist texts have always said, you know, one of the jewels is the Sangha. The Sangha is the community. If you don't have the community, then you don't have part of what the Buddhist material is all about. So they make movies about people who turn out to be either the last person on earth alive, or there's only 2 or 3 people that are alive trying to find each other. And just imagine if you suddenly found yourself to be the only person alive, the amount of things which would disappear from your life. Number one, nothing would be prestigious. Without somebody to appreciate how wonderful it is that I have something, there would be no sense of ownership and joy in having it. We are social creatures. The anguish of being all alone without another single human in the whole world would destroy most of us. I think it would do me. I would simply not know how to handle myself. What would it be like to have this total alienation where you just would be all by yourself? Would be horrible. And so, we have these movies like the one that Tom Hanks had where he was isolated on an island and he makes friends with the soccer ball that was built by the Wilson Company, so he names the soccer ball Wilson. He has to have something to communicate with. Without that communication, it's intolerable. It's just intolerable. So people who are hermits, if they can manage it, it may be wonderful for a very few people, but most people can't be hermits. It would become pathological. The other mystical thing is visualization, in which, for the Buddhist, when you meditate, there are 2 ways to meditate in the early texts. One of them is you have a Buddha image in front of you and you meditate on it. And they say you start up at the head and you meditate down to the feet, and then you go back up to the head and you just keep meditating on that object. But the other form of meditation is I look at something, I meditate on it, but I then visualize it. And I basically close my eyes and I no longer look at the one out there. I just meditate on the visualization I have in my mind. And it's that meditation on the visualization which particularly in the Tibetan tradition is the strongest and most valuable form of meditation. So if you go and get somebody who's really has the training to do a tanka for you, that is a painting, what they paint for you cannot be where they're looking at a copy on the wall and they're making a copy of that. What they paint is the visualization they have in their mind from past experience of the tanka. If they don't paint their visualization, it's not considered to have any power. And if it's done by stencils for the tourist, as far as the Tibetans are concerned, forget it, there's no power in it. But if it's painted by someone who has the ability to hold that image in their mind and to actually put it out there on canvas with paint and brush, those are considered to be enormously powerful spiritual objects. So you look at a painting like this, done by, this one was done by somebody who visualized. This was what he had in his thoughts. Now, I can't do this. I can't visualize like this. It takes practice, I suppose, and I also think it takes certain ability. And some people have it. My son and my wife have it because they're artists. They can visualize things. Any artist can do that, I think. I'm very sorry to tell you I can't do it, so I can't really tell you that I know what this is all about. I could never bring that visualization to the fore in that same way. But this is why when people begin to talk about what makes a painting, what makes it special, it has to be that it's part of a practice. And that it is part of an altered state of consciousness. And if you can have somebody paint an altered state of consciousness for you, you really have a treasure. Because you are being able to see and deal with something which ordinarily would be out of your experience. But at the same time, they also feel certain people shouldn't have it. If you want one of these painters to do one of these for you, they're going to have to feel that you're ready for it. If you aren't ready, it would be a disservice to you to give it to you. That's the dark side of it. That people who aren't ready for something, it can be destructive to them rather than helpful. So they really do judge you. Are you ready for this? So visualization can also be pathological. We can say that mental patients can be hallucinating, seeing visions, things that aren't there, we would say, things that terrify them. So that hallucinations can be a really horrible thing. Personal story, my mother had Parkinson's disease, and part of the Parkinson's disease for her was hallucinations. And she knew they were. And that was even harder for her because she said, I woke up in the middle of the night and the room was filled with suitcases. I knew it wasn't, but she said they were as real to me as if somebody had come in there and stacked up suitcases in my bedroom. The mind can produce a hallucinatory state, which we say is pathological. It doesn't enhance you. For her, it was not an enhanced thing to have those kinds of visualizations, which were not helpful. The other mystical thing that happens is the out-of-body experience. And the out-of-body experience, a lot of people are trying to figure out if that can be measured. So many people have said they have it, and there are many people who say they have it who seem to report extraordinary awareness of something that's distant. The Australian Aboriginals are the most adept at this in many ways. And the people who are beginning to study them ask the question of how is it that they seem to be communicating with each other at long distances and they're not doing anything that anybody else can see. So that it's the measurements that we're asking, how can you measure this? How can you possibly see whether or not, in fact, this out-of-body experience is real? So Charles Tart, who used to be at UC Davis, was one of the early people attempting to study this, and he would take you into a room and put you there and put a clock in the other room and ask you to try to travel to the other room and tell him what time it is. It was very interesting because some people were pretty good at it, but it only worked at the beginning of the experiment. The more they did the experiment, the less ability they had. It was as if the experimenting itself somehow removed part of this seeming ability to do it. So it's like once you're forcing yourself to do it, it won't work. It works best when it just comes upon you. So that out-of-body experience, trying to train yourself to do it, nobody seems to know exactly which one and what's the best. People who have it just say they have it. And doing it the other way is pretty rare. Other mystic powers that people are beginning to look at is telepathy. And telepathy is perhaps the easiest to measure. And that's, again, some of the work that's being done in Australia, that the Aboriginals do seem to use telepathy all the time. And they're trying to understand what is it they're doing when they communicate with each other some rather complex information. And it's measurable in one sense, but it's also disturbing to people in another sense because it goes against all our rational thought. That's why I've been very interested in watching the work that's being done with putting electrodes in the brain so that you can move a prosthetic limb just by thinking. That there is certainly, the brain is sparking at certain places, and when it sparks at that place, something happens. And they're learning how to do this. So some of this looks pathological at almost at one level, or it looks unmeasurable at another. But are we coming to a place where we will measure some ways in which the brain is transmitting? And that's to be yet decided, I think. Another thing is sacred geography, I call it. Why do people go on pilgrimage? Why is it so important to go to a special place? Why go to a sacred mountain? what is the feeling when I go to this special place? I have a different experience. I have a mystical experience if I go there. And these sacred spots are places that many people have agreed upon this is special. In this country, I have to say that one of the things that has really bothered me is Mount Rushmore. Mount Rushmore, where the faces of the presidents are carved, was a sacred site for the Native Americans. It was a very special place. They didn't want that place carved up. So that when I look at it, knowing that, it's like, I just don't like to look at it anymore. It seems like a desecration of a site which those people who were there had held as very special, and it had meaning to them, and the meaning is gone. The site has lost it for them, and there's no way they don't see how to ever recover it. We have other sites in sacred geography where they are power sites which are generated because a human did something there. We were talking the other day about the Alamo. The Alamo, for a lot of people, is a human-generated power site. You don't want to look too closely at the actual history of the event, but it's special to a lot of people. And the same is true for the Bodhi tree. The Bodhi tree, which was the site of the Buddha's enlightenment, is a human-generated power site. There's no indication that that site had that was recognized as that power before. But when something special happens in a place, it infuses it with a sense of power. And when you go there, whatever is happening, the very fact that you know what happened there and that you are aware of it makes you feel special in yourself and enhances a feeling of being in the presence of something that's different than being in another place. That is a mysticism of a type which we help to generate through human action, and yet it becomes something where we feel that we're in the presence of something of great power. Sacred mountains are everywhere in the world. Wu Tai Shan, for example, is one of the great sacred mountains of China. It's the home of Manjushri. It's not only a sacred mountain for the Chinese Buddhists, but also for the Nepalese Buddhists. People go there who believe they want to be in the site where Manjushri resided, or resides, perhaps. The spirit of this Bodhisattva is in that place. It seems like a very special place. I would say on Wu Tai Shan, the one that is the most interesting to me, but I can't do it, and now I'm too old to do it anyway. There's a rock that has a small opening. And the thing that you want to do is to enter into this small little cave that you barely fit in. And then you are reborn. They say it looks almost like the birth canal, and you come out and you are reborn. And going into that cave and understanding that this is a place where you go in and you kind of strip off all of your external stuff, and then you get reborn when you come out. people have very mystical experiences doing that. Mount Kailash is one of the most sacred mountains in the world, I suppose. It's a place where some of the great rivers of the world all arise from the snows from it. The rivers flow down in different ways. From space, it's a remarkable place in many ways. So people go in great pilgrimage to this spot, and when they come out, they feel quite different. Objects have power to induce special states. Listening to a bell, listening to a drum. Sometimes just hearing the sound of that where it reverberates can be allowing you to have a feeling of being in an altered state. And this is another way in which objects and all sorts of things are used to induce a state. I talked a little bit about paintings. That is, that the symbol and the power which is located in the painting is located within the parameters or the boundaries of that painting. And not everybody should look at that painting. It's too powerful, or they don't get it. And so by not getting it, they destroy part of its power. So a lot of times I've gone to Tibetan monasteries across Nepal, and I asked to see their books, and they would say, maybe not. And but a book is to be opened and read, right? No, every time you open that book, it loses a little of its power. Its power is the fact that it has a certain set amount of power, and by putting it on the altar, we are infusing it with power. But if you just open it and flip through the pages, you're going to destroy that. It's not to be read, it's to be used as a source of power. From an academic point of view, of course, we just get very antsy about that because we want to read it. And we have to back off and say, you can't do it. You were asking me the question about relics. Buddhism is a relic, from the beginning, was a relic cult. After the Buddha's cremation, the ashes, the bones, the teeth that were left after the cremation were all thought to be infused with the power of his enlightenment. And because they were so infused with this, to have even one tiny little thing as big as a mustard seed, you were in the presence of enormous power. And so they didn't have images in the beginning in Buddhism. They only had the relic. And they built these great mounds to house the relics. And people went to them to circumambulate them. And the very first Buddhist structures were cells that were built for meditators beside a stupa, beside the relic. And that's because still to this day in Myanmar, there are certain forms of meditation that require you to be in the presence of a relic. And if you aren't, you won't have it. I have a colleague who did this, and he's very almost unreligious in a way, and he did this meditation, went there and tried to learn how to do it, and he did it. And the meditation was, as you meditate, your body becomes crystalline. And it becomes like a bubble. And it shimmers, and that you have a sense of ecstasy. So he went back to his room, and he decided one night to have this meditation because he was having it every day. Nothing. He couldn't do it. So he went to the meditation teacher, who was a very famous meditation teacher. He said, I tried last night. Do I have to be next to you to have it? Is it you who's got the power? So he said, I'm going to send you on a journey. He called two of his disciples, and they knew what to do. They took him up to northern Myanmar, And they took him to this one big stupa there, and they said, let's have a little quiet meditation here. So they all sat down, and he had it just in a few minutes. And they said, you had it, didn't you? He said, yes, I did. How did that happen? And they said, because you can't have that experience unless you're near a relic. This stupa has a really famous relic. He still wasn't absolutely convinced because he's a hard nut to crack, and he was resisting this all the way. He said, this can't be happening to me. So he went to the museum, and they brought out an object, and they said, this is a relic we took out. We think that this is Shariputra's relic, but it's a very famous relic. And he had it without meditating. And he didn't like it. It was hard for him because the relic and the power, they felt you could sense it. The Buddhists were the first to develop relic worship of this type, or veneration. And it later was exported to Europe. And the first relics in Christianity were those of, said to be St. Thomas, who went to Goa in India, died there, and they shipped his bones back. And those became the first relics in Syria. So they recognized that this kind of thing came from India. The relic worship or veneration became a major part of the Catholic Church. Still is. Relics are really important, the relics of the saints. And I think this is one of Buddhism's great contributions to the religions of Europe, was relic veneration. And it's still a very powerful part of religious tradition. So, we've been talking about mysticism and oneness and the oceanic experience. How do you have it? You can see all the many ways in which you can have it. So it's like saying, in all of these cases, it's like a word that has many meanings is in and of itself meaningless. All of these rituals that have many different experiences have to be looked at for their own meaning. There is a kind of emptiness in any particular thing. You can go to a sacred mountain and have nothing. You don't know what it means, you're not prepared. It's like, well, is this all there is? You can go and look at a relic and so I don't feel anything. Recently there was a big Buddhist ceremony in Hong Kong, and the Chinese allowed them to take one of the famous Buddhist relics from China. They flew it down on its own airplane to Hong Kong. They closed the freeway, they put it on a special vehicle and drove it to the convention site where we were all waiting. There were about 12,000 of us waiting for this. We watched it on the screen as they took it off the plane. We watched the thing, and then finally they brought it into the hall. The interesting thing was, at that meeting, nobody said a word about relics. There was not a single mention of it from the platform. So at the end, when we were going to have the closing ceremony, the monk who was in charge of it said, you have to say something about relics because nobody else has. Please, you've got 5 minutes to tell us why this relic was important. And it's like, thank you very much. This is what I want in life. You've got, the next minute you're on, you got 12,000 people waiting for you to say something significant. But as I thought about it, and as I'm talking to you now, I thought all of us who were gathered in that hall, and there were people with all the different robes, the altars, the images, none of it would have been recognizable to the earliest Buddhists, the earliest followers of the Buddha. They would not have recognized any of that, but they would have understood the relic. And what the relic's power is, I think, is that it brings people together. People go to the reliquary sites in pilgrimage from all over. It's a place where Buddhists can meet regardless of their tradition, regardless of their teaching, regardless of their robes. None of that really matters in the presence of a relic. It's the most community-building practice that Buddhism has in many ways. And I felt that that was true for this conference in Hong Kong. Everybody felt the relic, and that nobody was disturbed by it. They weren't quite sure what to do with it, because the relic worship veneration has been pretty much downplayed through the years. But there is a resurgence of it. And part of that resurgence, I think, is that this is a form of power and mysticism and enhancement which can include the whole Buddhist community. And that these old-fashioned relic practice, which was the very first major practice of Buddhism, still has its role to play in terms of this ability to have a feeling of the power of this powerful thing that you have in front of you, and that to prepare yourself and to feel it is, whatever the nature of it is, you can put to one side in a sense. It's like an image. It is the memory. It is the veneration of the power of the person whose relic you feel or think you may have in front of you. So Buddhists are mystics in many ways, and they do it through all of these methods. And that is why, in one sense, when I say it's empty, mysticism is really empty except as we infuse it with our concepts, with our learning, with our projections. We're giving it its meaning. Because you can do exactly the same thing and it's pathological. You can fast and you're killing yourself. You can have all of these experiences of being by yourself, which can be either wonderful or alienation, pathological. So the emptiness of the practices is, it's not the practice in itself as such. It's how prepared we are and how we are taught how to make use of it in a way which is enhancing, which permits us to have these altered experiences that we wouldn't have otherwise. But we understand that part of that emptiness of it is its power. And that infusion and that development of those kinds of practices, I think, are still really valuable and will remain a valuable part of the Buddhist tradition. Thank you very much.